But I want to introduce you before we do anything, because obviously people know me, but people don't know you. So you are Anna Crowler,
Crowler, whichever.
And I am in awe of you. You're an amazing women's health physiotherapist who's just had her research paper published in a medical journal.
Okay, so my research work is basically around the concept that pelvic organ prolapse is caused by tension of pelvic tissues rather than weakness. So it's the idea that rather than the pelvic organs having fallen down through the pelvis because the pelvic floor has become weak, it's reframing the condition and saying that the organs are malaligned, not quite in the right place, because they're being pulled on by tensional imbalances, areas of tension within the pelvis, or up and down the chain. You know, up and down the body can knock things out within the pelvis too. And you know, I'm finding that a lot of the reasoning behind that is pelvic floor scarring, so tear scars and episiotomies, and that these areas of tension and restriction within the pelvic floor pull on the nearby soft structures, and so you get this malalignment. So yeah, it's a different way of thinking about prolapse, really, that it's in line with everything that we talk about with biotensegrity, which is sort of a modern approach to looking at the whole of human movement. So really it sits right within that.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, obviously you and I, this is our world, and fascia is something that's fascinating to both of us.
Yeah.
But a lot of our audience won't understand or know what fascia is and how it works. So yeah, one of the things that I have found fascinating is that biotensegrity, basically how it all merges together and pulls together. You know, it's like a load of layers, a lot of different connections that are happening and moving together. Do you want to explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, let me get my little biotensegrity model. It's on its last legs. It's on its last legs. It's going to break one of these days. So biotensegrity, so fascia, and you know, and everyone that works with you will already know this. So fascia is the connective tissue of our body. It's the stuff that covers and surrounds and connects everything. And in the olden days, when anatomy was first being worked out hundreds of years ago, the guys doing the anatomy work would remove the white pithy stuff and throw it in the bin so that they could get to
padding, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was the packing, and chucked in the bin and got rid of so that they could see and map the individual parts. Fine, and that kept us going anatomy-wise for several hundred years. But over the last century, this has really shifted and changed, and you know, and people have just changed the way that dissection happened, and they said, well, actually, you know, what is this white pithy stuff about? What does this packing stuff do? And it turns out it does everything, absolutely everything. It holds us together, it supports us, it transmits sensation, like far more sensation than you could possibly imagine. You know, it's shape shifting, it's such an important part of our body, and it's everywhere. It's within and around everything. It's the packing around everything that has so much meaning and so much purpose and so much function. So, you know, you can literally go down whichever rabbit hole you want to around fascia. You can go down the rabbit hole of how it transmits sensation or how it can change shape. And one of the rabbit holes that you can go down is the biotensegrity rabbit hole, which is looking at how the fascia of the body works as our support mechanism. Okay, so I've got my little bricks right here. So in the good old days of old classical anatomy states that we're built like this tower of bricks, and forces kind of work like that. Yeah, so we kind of built in the same mechanics as, say, a tower or a building, okay? And that's how we understood the body for centuries, and we understood that movement came through lever mechanics. So within that model, the only way that you can conceive of prolapse is that the organs have slipped and fallen down through the pelvis into the vaginal space. So the only way that you can conceive that that has happened is through a pelvic floor weakness. Okay?
Which is a lot of women think. They, you know, they believe
that's what every woman is told.
Exactly.
Yeah. We're absolutely told that through every, you know, every bit of writing about it, you know, the wording around it you know, the wording around it really, you know, it's a weakness, it's a failure of support, it's a loss of support. The language around it is really, you know, old hat, and it really promotes this concept that women have just fallen down within themselves, you know, and there's just this connotation within that it's that they're weak, they've let themselves down, you know.
Awful.
And actually
it comes with so much, you know, you've got the pregnancy, if they've had a difficult pregnancy, or if they've had a difficult birth, they're having to deal with that emotional side of things. And then they're told, well, everything is falling out. And you're like, oh,
your body is falling out of yourself. I mean, what's your emotional response to that going to be? You know, fear and panic, because your body is falling out of yourself. That's, you know, if that's how that's described and told to you culturally. So it turns out that that's an anatomical impossibility. That's just not how the body works at all. You know, we're not built like that. We're built like this, okay? So this is a biotensegrity model, okay? So the elastic bands represent the fascia, okay? And the coffee stirrers represent the organs and bones, okay? So what we now know, and this is not a theory, you know, biotensegrity is not like an idea that somebody came up with. This is a really well-established, well-rooted, absolutely backed up scientifically in many directions, you know. This is known. This is how human movement is, okay? And so what we now...
Let me interrupt you there for a second. So therefore, when they go and see the consultant who is not educated in this world to this extent, and they say, well, yes, everything's falling out, which they say sometimes to the clients.
Oh, yeah, all the time.
This is empowering women, because the part of the reason why I wanted to have this talk and that I created the Phoenix Health Hub was to empower people with knowledge so they can go to that person and say, well, actually, I've read up on biotensegrity and you're wrong. And I need you to find me a consultant that knows better. I need you to find me a physiotherapist that knows better. Sorry to interrupt you, but it was...
No, that's great, because biotensegrity is the physics of how we are held together. Yeah, so it's not like some one person's concept, you know. It was Dr. Stephen Levin that first put it forward, but since then it's been proven through so many different angles, from cellular biology, you know, to dissection, to, you know, mechanical force engineering, you know, it's fact. Biotensegrity is fact, and it changes the way that we look at human structure and movement completely. And instead of saying that we're a tower of bricks that work through lever mechanics, what we're saying instead is that everything is supported in a three-dimensional web of fascia, okay? So this means several things. What this means is that movement isn't a simplistic lever mechanics. Movement is a complex, dynamic, light and energy efficient process, okay? So we don't just move the arm like this, we can move the arm like this, because we're not actually working with levers, we're working with tensegrities, okay? So, because, you know, the way that tensegrities work, it's this balance of the firmer structures within the elastic network, okay? And so the way that movement comes in that kind of structure is through the sort of expansion and repositioning and contraction of these tensegrities down from, you know, a really tiny level to a massive level. So what this means for the body and the way that we understand the body is that it has an element of self-support to it that is not as reliant on gravity to hold it together as, say, a house, right? So a biotensegrity structure works just the same upside down. Like a woman doing a handstand works, you know, her body works, yeah? Or
I'll never forget in one of your lectures that you turned around and you said, you know, if you go upside down, your eyeballs don't fall out.
Yeah, well, this is it.
That was so wonderful.
And we can jump, you know, if we really were these brick upon brick upon brick, when we jump, our legs would explode under the force mechanics. And they don't, because we have an element of self-suspension, elastic dynamic self-suspension. So this completely changes how we understand pathology in general. Like, this completely changes how we understand things going wrong in the body. And primarily what it does is it says that if this is our nice balanced but dynamic structure, yeah, we can jump, we can move, we can twist, we can do a somersault, we can rotate, and then we can maintain our form. Yeah, our shape and our form are still there, okay? But when we have a problem in the system, that's because these elastic bands have become tensionally imbalanced. So basically, a tightness somewhere in the system knocks out the general alignment. So, you know, it's not that things just fall out, because that's impossible, but things can be pulled into a slightly different location or arrangement. Right. So that's biotensegrity. So what that means for prolapse is that it's a tensional imbalance within the pelvic floor. So it's a tension, not a weakness, which knocks out the alignment of the organs. That's what it means for prolapse.
If you have tension and not, can you have weakness?
As well as tension?
Yeah.
You can, but you can often resolve the weakness by resolving the tension. Treat tension first and the body will reorganize, and then everything will be optimally positioned and able to work as it should. Okay.
And for example, sometimes, you know, sort of I get clients that say, you know, my prolapse is so bad that I literally have to be able to go to the loo, I have to maneuver manually to be able to do the things that I need to do. Now,
that's actually a really common thing. It's a really common thing. Mm-hmm. I would always ask a woman that if she's coming to see me. A lot of women have to use a manual assistance to help them to defecate every day. It's a really big issue that's not really spoken about.
It's huge, and people don't talk about it, and they are so embarrassed. But it's kind of like it happens, and it happens more often than people think.
Yeah.
And
the thing is, it's why is that happening?
Go on.
The thing is, it's why is that happening?
That's what I was going to ask you, because in their mind, they think that literally their organ is, you know, that they can touch their organ and things are falling out, because obviously, as discussed before, this is what they've been told. So is it that it's falling out, or is it that, you know, if you can explain a little bit more, that would be great.
Yeah, cool. So yes, the organ is lower. If you're looking at top and bottom, yes, the organ is lower than it used to be. Total agreement, okay? Sometimes it's more that it's to one side than lower, but it's not in the right place, okay? So with the rectum, it's actually more that the shape of the rectum gets altered. With the bladder and the uterus, it's more that the organ is literally slightly off kilter. Right, I'm going to show you my contemporary dance to show you what a prolapse is.
Okay.
Right. So this is the inside of your pelvis, okay?
Yeah.
Right? I am your rectum. I am your rectum in your pelvis, and this is your pelvic floor muscles around the inside of your pelvis, okay? And here is where your bladder sits. It sits just above the pubic bone. It doesn't sit completely stationary. It's got a little bit of mobility to it, but it's got a little pocket which it likes to be in, okay? Mm-hmm. Give or take, more or less, depending on which way you're moving, okay? And then you've got this kind of roof of fascia within the pelvis, a bit like the roof of the Millennium Dome, and the cervix sits into that, okay? And the cervix is the lower part of the womb, yeah? Okay, So if I'm your rectum sat in the back of your pelvis, the older way of explaining prolapse says that I just fell into your vaginal space, okay? And that's what it says. It says, as a rectum, I fell into your vaginal space. And the only way that you can really put me back together is by squeezing these muscles and squeezing these muscles and squeezing these muscles, okay? But the bottom line is, Kegels don't really work for prolapse, not really very well. You can look at a few studies which say it's better than nothing for a bit, but it doesn't really fix it, okay? So if you look at things differently and say, okay, I'm here, I'm your rectum inside your pelvis, okay? And then you get a whole bunch of really tight tissue come down here, so that would be the back wall of your pelvis, okay? So that's like there, okay?
Yeah.
That is where all episiotomies are. All episiotomies are down the back wall of the right-hand side. All more recent ones, in the bad old days, they were central, but that's even worse for women. But,
so we can explain really quickly what an episiotomy is. I mean, you know, when I explain it to people, you have different degrees, and they basically just cut, you know, depending on the degree they cut, so that the baby can come out, because they're, you know.
And depending on when that cut is made, different amounts of tissue get cut, right? But essentially, you're going to have a tension coming up here down the back of the pelvis. And what that does is it adheres onto the nearby soft structures. So here I am being your rectum, and this scar comes here, and it literally adheses me down into it. So there is your bulge. There is where the poo gets stuck and you can't get it out. There is your prolapse. But you're not going to get rid of it by squeezing these muscles. You're going to get rid of it by releasing this tension here. And then the rectum will go back to where it wants to go, okay? Or there's like a big fascial structure called the tala, okay? And this runs around the inside of the pelvis. So this kind of really linked onto the bladder at the front. So what can happen is this tension can build up around the inside of the pelvis, usually on one side, sometimes both sides, but usually on one side. And eventually the bladder just gets pulled out of its happy place, yeah? So yes, it's a bit lower than it should be, but importantly, it's usually to one side or the other, okay? And there's your bladder prolapse. There's your difficulty starting a wee off. There's your going for a wee and standing up and a little bit more wee dribbling out. That's your anterior bulge, yeah? And what happens with the cervix is that the tension kind of travels up this side and it just pulls that roof of fascia until the cervix is down to one side. Cervixes are always to one side or the other. And that is what's associated with that real dragging sensation. So yes, the organ is shifted, but it's not fallen. It's being pulled by tension, usually in one side or the other, but not always. Sometimes it's in both sides.
And let's say, I presume, you know, sort of having an episiotomy, having a tear, or just literally having a vaginal birth will cause pelvic floor.
Yeah,
because
some stats will say 90%. Yeah. Some stats say 90% of women who've had a vaginal delivery have some degree of scar tissue in their pelvic floor. And we know that scar tissue tightens up tissue. So, you know, the older way of explaining prolapse would say that birth can cause pelvic floor weakness because the tissues get stretched. And so you have to strengthen it, hold everything up and in. And the new way would say that birth can cause damage to pelvic floor tissues by either experiencing a cut or a tear, which will then scar, or having another minor injury like a bruising or a bashing of, you know, as the baby's elbow comes down, you can get a bruising of a certain part of the tissue. And what that does is it tightens it up.
And
so
tighten it up because it creates the adhesions through the fascia.
Yeah.
Okay. So if that's the case, does that mean that somebody suffering from pelvic girdle pain during pregnancy or sacral, you know, sort of sacral dysfunction, that they will be more prone or there's more of a correlation with pelvic floor issues, or not necessarily, or it hasn't
not
been?
necessarily. Not necessarily. So pelvic girdle pain usually comes from a malalignment of the bony pelvis. Okay, so if the bony pelvis, and again, this is something, so say a pregnancy related pelvic girdle pain. So what is quite common in that sort of situation is that women will have had a little bit of a niggly knee, or a little bit of a niggly ankle, or a little bit of a niggly something somewhere in their body that their body has coped with. Because if there's their pelvis, and say you've got a niggly something happening in this end of the body, so this pull just happens on the pelvis, but basically the body copes with it, right? So say you've got like a bad knee, you've got a left knee injury that you've had for 20 years, okay, and your pelvis is quite firmly together, so that knee injury is a knee injury. But then you add relaxin into the mix, and that knee injury turns into a bit of a downward pull on one side of the pelvis, and that turns into a malalignment of the bony pelvis and pelvic pain. So usually with pelvic girdle pain, the way out of it during pregnancy is realignment work. So that's, you know, standard external body work, you know, that's massage therapy, that's physiotherapy, that's osteopathy, to just tweak that alignment. And usually when the relaxin levels go down, that's
in theory should go back. Because the reason I was thinking about that this morning, I was thinking, well, you know, sort of if they have been malaligned and it's uncomfortable, and then they, you know, they sort of shape it back, would the adhesions not be in the pubic bone or in that kind of area to impact the pelvic floor, or am I completely overthinking it?
Where it's a simple pelvic girdle pain, so this is usually your first pregnancies. Yeah. Usually it will resolve afterwards as the body just adjusts postnatally. What is sort of more complicated is when in successive pregnancies, and it's usually a different shape of pain, it's in a different place, it's a different severity, it starts at a different time. Now, if that malalignment is coming from an issue in the pelvis that was picked up in the previous birth, now this can be more linked into pelvic floor problems. Okay. And another thing about second pregnancies is, so if, say, you've had that episiotomy or tear in the first birth, and then everything gets knitted back together, but in an imbalanced way, because that's the nature of knitting things back together after tears and episiotomies, is that, you know, that's going to be on one side, so there's going to be a tighter level of tissue there. But sometimes the body will cope with that, and the mum might feel okay, and then a successive pregnancy, a second child a year or two later, and then the body goes, oh, do you know what, that injury from the first birth, I can't actually handle that now. So quite often you see women with a pelvic floor dysfunction, and they come in and they go, you know, the first kid, this birth was killer and I was okay, and then the second birth was really easy and now I have problems. That's a really common story. Yeah, and that's because
in my clinic a lot.
Yeah. It's because the dysfunction was laid down in the first birth, and that tension, we cope with it until we ask the pelvis for maximum elasticity again. Yeah.
And tell me, when, for example, somebody who has had an episiotomy, let's look at different timelines. They've just had an episiotomy or a tear, you know, sort of first, second, it doesn't really matter the degree, it's there. Yep. And it's healing and it's painful and they don't really know what to do. Some people say do pelvic floors, some people say don't do anything. They're scared to practically even breathe. And it's very, very painful. What do you recommend? I mean, a lot of the time I say to clients, you know, do move your pelvic floor, try and engage with it a little so that you start bringing some movement and some oxygen into the area. Yeah. But is there anything else that you could recommend or suggest, especially if it's just recent?
But if it's those early days and weeks, so two things really in those first couple of weeks, three things maybe. So one is acknowledging that. So one is acknowledging, you know, 2 inches of pelvic floor tissue just got cut, you know, and acknowledging that, because I think, again, we have a little bit too much of like, well, it's normal, love, get up and get on it. And it's like, you know, she's got a 2-inch cut in her pelvic floor. Let's just heal that, you know? And so I think acknowledging that injury is really important. And I really feel like those first early days and weeks, that resting and getting off it and offloading, it's basically loads of lying on your side, loads of being in bed, loads of getting your partner to do all the housework, just lying in bed, feeding the baby and eating well is really important to allow a recovery, you know? And yes, I'm with you on introduce some movement. And I think it's better to introduce gentle, functional movement. So pottering about the house, you know, gentle, functioning movement. I don't think it's appropriate to do lots of Kegels right in the early days because, you know, again, you've got a big cut that needs
you're
to
asking
heal.
the muscle to move while it's got stitches. You wouldn't do that. But it's
You would never do that for the bicep. You would never do that for the bicep. If you had a laceration of your biceps muscle, your response to that would not be, remember to contract it 30 times a day, otherwise you've let yourself down. Our response would not be that. It would be, take it steady.
Yeah.
So
move it gently, you know, carry things gently, that kind of thing. I mean, it's one of the things as a person that has been dealing with pre and postnatal women for over a decade is I find it really difficult and challenging. Society's pressure on mothers, and because they have that pressure and because they have the adrenaline flowing, the cortisol and adrenaline, they think I can do everything and I have to do everything. So I think the suggestion of just, you know, just rest, just take it easy, just give yourself, you know, if you've had major surgery, you wouldn't be running a marathon. So just slow it down. So, but what else, from what point do you think that they should start being active and start actually focusing, not necessarily on Kegels, but on exercise?
Okay, so I would probably say, you know, you want to be really, really slow for those first kind of 3 weeks. And if everything progresses normally and there's no infections in the wound, if there's an infection in the wound, you need to start from ground zero. Once that infection is cleared, now is day 1 of your 3 weeks of rest. So you've got to really slow it down. But if there's no infection, then, you know, getting moving gently, pottering around and starting doing some nice flowing functional movements at, say, week 6-ish, give or take a couple, you know, maybe 6, 7, 8, depending on how you're feeling emotionally, what your fitness levels were like before. And then towards 12, I would be looking to do some stuff that's really going to work into the pelvis. It's like, okay, pelvis, right, we're ready to rehab. So I think primarily that is best done through mobilizing any tissue that's become tight. So that can be self-massaging and self-treatment of any scars. And it can be, you know, beautiful functional movements that include sort of hip and trunk and pelvis releases, as well as sort of starting to connect and stabilize globally. So, you know, well-designed Pilates and yoga by somebody that knows what they're doing, okay? Not loads of isolated contractions done in anxiety or fear, and equally not kettlebells and boot camp.
Woo! I'm glad you said that, because it's really interesting. One, you know, it depends obviously on the person and their fitness levels. Some, you know, they're super fit and they feel totally in a different body and they just want to go back. They want to go out to the gym. They want to start, you know, kettlebells. They want to start doing their massive squats. And you're like, no. I mean, it's interesting because when people phone me for Pilates rehab, and you know, they've said, I've just had my babies 10 weeks ago. I want to start tomorrow. And I'm like, no, I'm sorry. I don't want to see you until you're at least 13 weeks. You know, and you need for that adrenaline to calm down. You need to actually just have some time with your baby moon, you know, and you need to connect to your body. But I think one of the things that also happens that I've found, and I don't know whether you have found this, is their body changes so dramatically that they don't want to see themselves from literally their breasts down. They just don't want to acknowledge their body. So it's very difficult for them to actually connect with the abdominals, you know, sort of, for example, dealing with diastasis recti. They don't, you say, you know, let's contract and connect, and they're like, I don't know how. In the same way as when you say, let's do a Kegel exercise, they go, I just don't feel anything.
Yeah.
So in relation to the pelvic floor, if that's how they're feeling, I mean, I always say if you work with intention and you work with touch, it helps a lot. How else do you think that they could help themselves, especially at the moment in this lockdown that they can't see anyone?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are offering Zoom consultations, and there is Zoom, you know, you're doing YouTube videos, aren't you, of your exercise programs, and I think you can access postnatal Pilates and yoga widely on the internet, and you do want to have the feedback of your tutor. You want your tutor to be able to see you, so you know the same rules would apply in a normal Pilates situation, which is 4 or 5 people being watched by someone who has good qualifications in postnatal care and is a mother usually, is going to be good. Yeah, back at the class of 30 in a leisure centre where you're not being looked at is, you know, you're going to injure yourself. You know, it's about sort of a careful level of supervision.
And same at the moment with the Zoom, you know, sort of a class of 30 with somebody who says that they are, you know, in this is not the way to go, because they're not going to be able to see you and put your level of rehab first.
Because you need to acknowledge that you've run a marathon, that you've done something massive, whether or not there's a scar or not, however you gave birth or not, however difficult or easy the birth was, you have to acknowledge that what your body's just been through is massive. And now your life just changed completely. So you can't just click your fingers and have back your old body and your old you. Instead, it starts with acknowledgement and going, okay, so this is where I'm at, and this is my rehab journey, and this is how long I'm going to take. You know, 4th trimester, you know, is a really important thing. Of that first 3 months after the baby comes is the 4th trimester of pregnancy. The hormones are still everywhere. The body shape is not supposed to look like a pre-pregnancy body. It's supposed to look like you just had a baby, you know. I really think walking is such great exercise. So walking is great for the pelvic floor, you know, and you can really progress that by saying, I'm going to walk a more challenging path. I'm going to walk further. I'm going to walk on a slight incline. I'm going to walk faster, you know. So you can start with, I'm going to potter out to the park with my baby and probably my toddler as well, you know, and you can progress that up to, okay, I'm going to put on my lycras, put on my earphones. I'm going to tell my family I'm going out, and I'm going to power walk, you know. Yeah. And that's a power walk, not a run. A run is a different thing. That's a different conversation. But you can go, right, I'm going to do this, cardio, and then power walk. So walking is a really wonderful exercise, and you can make it even better by going barefoot. Because when you're walking barefoot, you're bringing in real sort of mobility and elasticity through this back part of the pelvis, which is, you know, where so many problems lie. So when you walk in shoes, there has to be a stiffness in the back of the pelvis. And when you walk barefoot, there's a rotation and a constant sort of rejiggling happening just here. Your body works here to sort of open and close and mobilize and stabilize and be all sorts of different things. So
that makes a lot of sense, because obviously when you're walking, your foot is moving in all directions, so your leg is moving in all directions, causing a kind of movement of the entire muscle of the pelvis. Genius.
Yeah, so barefoot walking is great, and so is, like I said before, well designed and considered functional movement. And you know, I'm not really a believer in this one exercise or that one exercise. You know, the class that works for you with the teacher that you believe in, that you trust, that you can get to, you know. And actually what a lot of fascia science tells us is that it's not about one specific exercise. It's about a diversity of movement, a range of movements, not static postures. So a well-designed postnatal class and loads of barefoot walking is like bang on. And then, as I say, about sort of 12 weeks, but put that back if you've had infections, put that back by a few weeks. So you can really start to mobilize that tissue one way or the other. You can do it through movement, you can do it through massage to your buttocks, your hips, your glutes, or you can get right onto your scar. And again, acknowledge that that scar is there, you know, self-map a little bit, you know, what's this side like where I don't have pain and I didn't have a cut? What's this side like where I do have pain and I did have a cut? A little bit of self-mapping goes a long way.
And in my opinion, it's also, don't be frightened to touch your body. It's your vessel. It's what you're driving every day. And if you learn to feel it and actually, you know, massage it in a particular way, it can release the scarring, and it can release, I think emotionally as well, it can release a lot of different baggage that you're holding on. You know, let's say if you had a traumatic birth or something, you know, you're nurturing yourself and looking after and valuing yourself, honoring yourself.
Yeah. And honoring this body part and what this body part has just done for you and your family, you know, and saying, okay, maybe this body part is injured, so I'm going to nurture my vagina, I'm going to nurture my perineum, I'm going to nurture my pelvic floor, you know, I'm going to give it a little bit of, like I say, start with self-mapping, what's going on down there, you know, and then a little bit of desensitization, and then eventually, you know, you can really massage those tissues. They're going to thank you for that, because that's what you would do with any other body part.
I was just thinking, you hit your elbow, you rub your elbow, you know, so why can't you rub your vagina? You know, it's as I say to a lot of my clients that, you know, sort of when I'm seeing them or we're doing classes, is your vagina, your back passage, whatever you want to call it. I'm very factual about things with them. And they kind of get all shy, and I'm like, would you talk about your arm in a different way? Would you be embarrassed by your arm in a different way? And then they sort of relax and they go, okay, you know, and the barriers get removed. But I wanted to ask you, let's bring it, you know, sort of further down the line. If you have teenage children, you know, or older children, and you've been wearing, you know, pads for many years because you leak, and you've been told, well, this is just the way it is. Is there a salvation? Is there a way to improve it? Can you fix it?
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely can. And it's the same method, you know, it's acknowledging reality. It's acknowledging what was the injury that you picked up on that pelvic floor. Okay, what has your body been telling you? If it's been 20 years, have you had a hip pain or a back pain or a pelvic pain all those years? Because that's going to help you find where that is coming from. Yeah. So I think body mapping generally is a really good idea. And you know, a lot of women will live with little back pains and little hip niggles and things like this. But if you draw it, you know, get a body chart, you know, and draw where are all of my aches and pains, it's going to correlate with the side that has the tighter, tenser or more damaged pelvic floor. Okay. So then, you know, internal self-mapping. Yep, that's right. That's where I feel the scratchy scar from 20 years ago. That's where I feel the tender, bruisey ache of that tissue being under a little bit too much strain. Okay. And then the other thing that we need to acknowledge is physical reality. And this, you know, biotensegrity, this is fact. This is how the body works. Okay. And that means things don't fall out of vaginas, but they can be pulled out of their normal and happy alignment. So going forward into your self-mapping with that knowledge, you can look for, well, if I'm tight through the hip here, if I've got tension through my back here, okay, so I think, you know, the pull is going to be somewhere on this side of my pelvis. Okay, and then looking internally for those scratchy, sharp, bruisey, tender, achy areas, you know, and actually that is likely to be where the pull is coming from. Yeah. So, and yeah, you know, the work is slower if you've had this condition for many years. Little caveat here that I'm just going to say this, that once pelvic surgery, like big pelvic surgery, like an anterior or posterior repair or a hysterectomy, anything in that sort of category, once that has happened, it's a different kettle of fish. You can't just release the tension and ask things to realign because they've been surgically altered. Okay.
And
so if they're
the amount of scarring that surgery would have caused.
And you can't expect the body to reorganize. So under normal tensegrity rules, if you release the adhesion, the body will reorganize. But if there has been radical pelvic surgery, that option has now closed. So you're looking at a different thing and you're going to need more help, okay? And really it's about bringing down the whole tone of the whole system. But if that surgery hasn't happened and you're dealing with the injuries from the birth and the years which have gone by since, then yeah, that is all treatable and correctable. You just need to find all those tensions and release them. And yeah, you know, different women are going to need different amounts of help. But I'd say you need some help with the massage bodywork side of things, and you need some help with the movement side of things. That might be the same person, or it might be two people.
Okay, amazing. And in regards to, I mean, I've been teaching my clients to grab, you know, sort of a few socks, put them together in a ball, and to sit on it.
Oh yeah.
And release, you know, just naturally, just, you know, let it all.
Oh yeah. And all right round the sit bone. It's a really good exercise. So, you know, if you've done your sort of classic sort of glute and hip release work, and then, yeah, you want to take it a little further so that you're releasing right under here. So, yeah, that's, you know, massage ball over the back part, so over the anus part of the perineum, and then just sink yourself over it. Allow the sit bones to sink either side. You might find that one side you want to focus some more massage around that area. You know, you can do that sitting on the floor or sitting on a chair. So that's all really, really great stuff to mobilize into that area. And then following that up with some lovely release-based hip and pelvis movements is always going to be really helpful.
And when it comes to scarring, I know that sometimes they stitch women up very, very tightly, and it can be excruciatingly painful. What can they do? I mean, apart from going back and get it redone, you know, if it's
well, I actually don't. So I cannot tell you how cross this makes me on so many levels. And, you know, and often these are the women that, you know, in those early days, they just absolutely know that they're not okay. Nothing feels okay, and they know they're not okay. And they go and they ask for help, and somebody takes a look and goes, well, yeah, it's like a penis-shaped canal. So, you know, tick, that's great. Off the top, love. You know, and she's got no stretch in there, you know, and she needs stretch in there just to walk, you know. She's got to have stretch in there to be able to walk, to be able to sit, to be able to function on any level. And if there's no stretch in there, she's not going to feel okay, and that is going to pull on everything. So, you know, you're going to get all manner of pelvic floor dysfunction with that sort of thing. And it's really difficult to get you know, sort of more traditional gynecologists to recognize that, okay? And also, you know, they've got a job on their hands, haven't they? When they first look at that wound on delivery suite, and their priority is, we've got to keep the infection out of here. And quite right, because if you get an infection in there, you're going to have a greater degree of scarring and adhesion. So quite right, I need to look after this woman. I need to make sure that there's no infection in there and keep this nice and clean, you know. And everyone that's doing those stitch-ups is absolutely doing their best, you know, with their training and their skill level and what they're going in there to do. And sometimes it's really difficult for them. Sometimes, you know, there's maybe a hemorrhage happening, so, you know, they literally can't see what they're doing, you know, or there's a lot of bruising. Again, this is really going to up the ante.
You know, it's swelling. You don't actually know what you
can't do that. Yeah. So you do sometimes see some stitch ups that are not very good, but you know, when you just, that story it always comes with, and then there was a medical emergency, and then there was this, and then, you know, and it's like, you know, they did their absolute best given a really difficult situation. But the bottom line is that if that woman is too tight, she is going to feel too tight, and she's going to feel like she's not okay. And actually it's loads and loads and loads of self-release work is the way forward. I probably, you know, this Fenton's procedure that they do sometimes. So It's when things don't heal right, and then the gynecologists go in and repair or revise this.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, sometimes I think what's actually happening there is that the tension that's in the pelvic floor, perhaps from a previous birth, is kind of stopping that wound come back together. So actually the last thing they need is that cutting and then revising. Actually, you know, I'm a big fan of going and finding where the tension it is, and it might be away from this wound, it might be a tension that's from a previous wound. So I'm a big fan of releasing the tension to allow things to heal properly, and I'm a big fan of releasing tension later down the line.
Mm-hmm.
And you do have to be really careful about infection, so you can't be doing any self-massage until everything's really fully healed. And if you do get an infection in there, then you've got to just, the weeks, say you get an infection at week 2, you then got to, that is now ground zero. I'm now going to count 12 weeks from here. And if there's another infection, you've got to count from there. So it can be a really rough ride for some women. And those are the women that are really going to need input when they get to 4 or 5 months. You know, they are more likely to need help. But the women that everything just kind of knits back together, but they get to sort of 10, 12 weeks and it just feels a bit restricted or tight or not quite right,
Mm-hmm.
you know, just self-massage and self-care in there is really good.
And lastly, because I know I'm aware of time, and I am aware that your beautiful children have been very patiently waiting in the background.
I'll go downstairs and like the walls will be blue with like pink. That'll be fine.
But lastly, and this might be opening Pandora's box, but I think you've probably answered it already, is I many times get in clinic women very embarrassed saying that they find sex excruciatingly painful. And they don't know what to do. And that could be due to an episiotomy, but that could also be due to birth, or not actually, even with people with C-sections, post-birth. They have this thing that, you know, it's like razor wire. So I'm wondering, one, why would that happen, especially if somebody has had a C-section, for example? What would cause that? Because the only assumption that I have is that it suddenly becomes super, super tight.
Yeah, so the cause can be a few different things. So number one, anyone who has perineal, vulval or vaginal pain needs to stop doing Kegels, like now, like yesterday. If there are vaginal pain symptoms, vulval pain symptoms, and perineal pain, pain means too much tension, too tight. Kegels is only going to make that worse. Okay, so first line treatment for anyone with that sort of issue going on, no Kegels. Second line treatment is working, where is that pain coming from? So yeah, sometimes it's a structural thing. Yeah, this wound here, it's not okay, it's going to need some help. Okay, and sometimes it's a gripping, a real sort of gripping, which can come from, you know, any other physical injury or ailment up and down the chain. That means that body is not working very well. And then, you know, something in the sort of panic and anxiety, I'm not okay, I'm falling out of myself. Stuff in this category is really going to ramp up the tension. So, you know, and also just doing the wrong kinds of exercise as well, actually, you know, so doing kettlebells and boot camp in those early weeks is going to send those recovering muscles into spasm. So you can have a number of different causes to that. The C-sections always ask, you know, well, why did you go to section? How far did you get? Well, you know, that's going to tell you a lot about what's happening at the pelvic floor. Sometimes baby got stuck deep within the pelvis. So that's that injury that you're now seeing, is that they pushed baby's head in the wrong place in their vagina for hours, you know, so that's now what you're picking up, you know. And sometimes it's not that, sometimes it's something, it can be anything, but it's always an interesting question as to, and why.
Again, if they are suffering from an incredibly painful sex, I mean, my suggestion is play, use your breath, you know, try and enjoy and open up, not literally physically, but to just try and love that space.
And teaching and training, teaching relaxation. So this is an incredible tool for a lot of women in pain And if there's an anxiety component to that pain, which, you know, might be, I don't want to hurt my vagina, or it might be, I don't want to upset my partner, or it can be anywhere in between, or all manner of these things. So teaching, you know, a body awareness and a down training and a relaxation. So a lot of this is, you know, really sort of simple breathing, meditative work to bring down the tone, you know, because you can have a pelvic floor dysfunction with a structural problem, and you can have a pelvic floor dysfunction that is just too high tone. And actually, you know, a lot of work you can focus here on sort of awareness, mind control, releasing, relaxing, and all that's really going to feed in, you know. And also, you know, yes, I agree with you completely on the women that are happy to have sex and want to have sex and want to be with their partner, but their body is getting in the way and their body is stopping them, but their emotions are totally on board. Then yeah, all of the play and enjoying of the space and the foreplay and the cuddles and all of this. But, you know, also there's also women that maybe the emotions aren't fully on board. Maybe that's because they're afraid of more pain, or maybe they're just really tired with the baby, you know. And actually just really, you know, permission to not, you know, you don't owe him anything, and you're recovering, and, you know, and helping to them to go, you know, sometimes, you know, a lot of women don't get around to having sex in the first year, you know, because first there's pain, and then there's emotional stuff, and then there's a baby, and, you know, so it's okay to not.
And it's okay. Absolutely.
Yeah. Whatever is right for that woman. There's a nice book, where is it? This one, Kathy Wallace, Reviving Your Sex Life After Childbirth, is a really good resource.
Just have a look. Sorry, I've lost you there for a second. Show me again.
Reviving Your Sex Life After Childbirth by Kathy Wallace.
Brilliant.
Of Herman and Wallace in the US, like big pelvic physio providers in the US.
Okay. Well, look, Anna, thank you so much for informing us, for giving us, you know, an hour of your time, especially on such a beautiful sunny day in England.
No.
Really, really appreciate it, because I think this will help a lot of people. Now, if they want to get a hold of you, do you have a website? Can I sort of share your website on this particular page?
Yeah, you can share my website, and if you are a woman experiencing problems, then I can do a video consultation. And if you are a professional working with women experiencing problems, then I've got a little seminar. I've got my research paper and a short seminar, which is like a whole bunch of like techie and anatomy and science.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. For me, I wanted to let you know, because you don't know, I've just, I am launching a rehabilitational class for postnatal women online. Oh, they're very, very small, and they're going to be on Zoom. So, you know, sort of talking about what we were talking about, and, you know, sort of movement, bringing movement into the early days of postnatal women. So, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.